Good evening. This is the 13th of April, and as you can see, I've moved out of the studio into my greenhouse. Outside there's snow flurries, high wind blowing, and it's freezing. Inside, I'm in my shirt sleeves, just at a nice, comfortable temperature. You might be able to see down in front of me a few seedlings that I've planted out. Here it is, the 13th of April. I've got lettuce 2 or 3 inches high, broccoli and cabbage planted out. In other words, a garden that you'd expect to see outside around the end of June in most places around Newfoundland. This is just a come on for greenhouses. I think greenhouses are fantastic, and I think you ought to look into them if you become seriously interested in gardening. And behind me you can see the frame of a geodesic greenhouse that I'm going to be setting out outside and testing this summer. Now, the subject of today's lecture is seeding and transplanting. Well, let's assume that you've prepared your garden, prepared your soil according to all the instructions which you previously received. You've drawn your plan and bought all your seeds. Now, I'm sure you're all very impatient to rush out into the garden and start planting. My advice to you is don't. 2 years ago, a neighbor of mine got out early in the spring and dug up his garden and got everything prepared and planted it, and he was very proud of himself because he had it all planted by the first week of May. By the middle of June, when I was planting my garden, his turnip were up about 1 inch, and his carrots had just barely broken the ground, and you could just barely see the little tiny red seedlings of the beets. In other words, for almost a month and a half, the garden had sat there and done nothing. By the first week in July, both our gardens were equally advanced, and from there on there was no difference, except that mine was a little bit better garden because it was better fertilized. Last year my tiller broke down, and instead of planting the garden when the rest of my students planted it about the middle of June, I had the job of double digging my whole garden, and this took 2 weeks. So I didn't put a seed in the ground until the 1st of July. It was about 2 weeks after my students had planted. By mid-July, both gardens were equally advanced. Now, don't assume from this that I have a magical effect on gardens. The truth is that seeds sprout and plants grow in the proper season, and you cannot hurry them along except under greenhouse conditions. So what is the best date to start planting seeds? I can't tell you, because this is going to vary in each and every region. But I can give you a few hints, some signs that you could use to guide you in your garden, in your planting times. I don't plant my garden until the alders and the willows and the birch leaves are fully out. That means about mid-June around Logie Bay. I don't like to plant my garden until the first good crop of weeds has grown in the garden. I like to prepare my garden, let the bed sit, get a good crop of weeds grow up, and then I can go over the whole garden quickly with a hoe, dig up all those weeds, kill them down, and then I plant my first seeds. This saves me an enormous amount of trouble later on when it comes to weeding. The way I figure it is this. Weeds are weeds because they're extremely tough, extremely hardy, very fast-growing plants. They can outmuscle, outgrow, and outsurvive practically any vegetable. If the ground is too cold for the weeds to sprout, then don't expect your vegetables to grow. If you plant your vegetables before the first flush of weeds, you have a good chance of losing them in the vigorous growth of the weeds. If you want to save them, you're going to have to do a lot of very painful hand weeding. If, however, you hold off until the first flush of weeds is grown, and then go out early on a sunny morning, hoe over the surface of the garden, and I emphasize a sunny morning, that will root up all the weeds and the roots will die off in the dryness of the day, and the weeds will be killed back. Then, the following day, you can start planting your hardiest vegetables. Now, you're going to be planting over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, starting out by planting your hardiest vegetables and ending up by planting things like beans and marrow and the tender vegetables. The final preparation of the soil for seeding should be done with care. And this is especially important when the seeds are very small, like lettuce, savory, and carrots. If your soil is very rough and cloddy, as mine was following the double digging last year, you may find it necessary to screen a little soil before planting your fine seeds. The larger seeds, like peas and beans, can just be shoved into the ground with your thumb without worrying too much about the soil texture. The depth of planting varies with the size of the seed. A good rule of thumb is plant 4 times the depth of the diameter of the seed. If the seed is 1/4 of an inch in diameter, plant the seed 1 inch deep. The object in planting is to place your seeds in a warm, moist environment in which to grow. If you plant too deep, the seedlings might have to expend too much effort pushing their way to the surface. And if you plant too shallow, the surface of the ground is likely to dry out in the first bit of sunshine that you get, and this will desiccate the plants and kill them. Seeds should be planted a little bit deeper in sandy soil than in clay soils, because sandy soils have a greater tendency to dry out. If immediately following the planting you experience a long series of hot, dry, windy days, it's a good idea if you go out and water your seed beds in the evening. If you compact the soil gently on top of the freshly planted seed beds, this will also help to keep the soil nice and compact around the plant, give it the moisture which it requires. Now, just because you won the first battle with the weeds, don't think the war is over. Weeds will continue to plague you until you have established a heavy mulch cover. For this reason, it is essential to know precisely where you planted your seeds. The easiest way is to place guide strings on your garden. Plant your seeds immediately under the strings and leave the strings in the garden at least for the first part of the season. I find that it's a fairly good idea to use a very light cotton twine. If you use a very light cotton twine, you can put it down in the garden and leave it there, and by the fall, the cotton twine has completely rotted into the soil. If you use a plastic twine, you're going to have to pull it up again. The second crop of weeds, usually fewer this time, will emerge with your vegetables. Now your problem is distinguishing weeds from vegetable seedlings. Now, seedlings are like cows or babies. They all look alike until you examine them carefully. If you can't distinguish a baby weed from a baby turnip or carrot, use your string. If a particular kind of seedling is scattered haphazardly all over the place, it's probably a weed. And if it is only found in a very narrow line under the string, then that's your vegetable. Here are a few typical seedlings that you are likely to come across. This bean seedling is a very easily recognized seedling, and I put this on first because I want to point out a few characteristics of a seedling which you ought to be looking for. On the left-hand side of the screen, the seedling is just emerging from the ground, and the most obvious things which you see there are the cotyledons. These are the first leaves. These are big, fat leaves, yellowish in color, and they are the seed leaves, the cotyledons. And their purpose is to supply a store of energy to get the young plant started in its early growth. Very quickly, the first true leaves emerge, as you see on the right-hand side, and these are regular leaves which produce their own food by photosynthesis with the sun, and very quickly the cotyledons shrivel up and die. Here's the seedling, the bean seedling emerging from the ground. You can see the cotyledons, and there is the bean seedling with the first true leaves. The pea is a legume also. Note the little tendril coming out the end of the seedling. These are the tendrils which will wind around support posts to hold the plant up. Here's a pea seedling. Just at the top right-hand side, you can see the tendril coming out. Very distinctive seedling. The vetch, you also see the seedling. This is also a legume, but it's a weed. Everybody ought to be able to recognize the clover with its typical three-part leaf. Now, this is a group of seedlings which you're going to have to recognize. These are the cole crop, the brassica seedlings. Note the heart-shaped cotyledons. The two leaves sticking out the side are the cotyledons, and they're distinctive throughout the brassica. Note the heart shape. And the first true leaves are coming out top and bottom. There's a turnip. See the same heart-shaped leaf with the little true leaf coming out through the middle. Now here is a weed. Now that's a type of nettle. Some people call it pigweed. Now those first cotyledons look deceptively like the brassica. They look deceptively like cole crops, but note that the ends are rounded. They're exactly the same size, but the ends are rounded, and the true leaves are hairy. Take those weeds out as quickly as you can, because they're the worst weeds in the garden. It grows, that's what it grows into, a nettle-like plant, one of the nettles. That's not a stinging nettle. And there's a young cabbage plant, just putting forth, same kind of heart-shaped cotyledons. And there it is, starting to develop a couple of the true leaves. The beet is recognized by the long strap-shaped first leaves, cotyledons, and it's also very easy to recognize because the stems are bright red. The spinach also has long strap-shaped cotyledons sticking out the sides there, and the first leaves are very dark green color, oval color you see there. And there you see the, I think that's a chard actually, but the chard and spinach and beets are all closely related. Here we have carrot. Note the very long grass-like first leaves, very easy to confuse. A early seedling carrot, as you see on the right-hand side, with an early spear of grass. But if you let it grow a little while, you'll see this very fuzzy little true leaf coming out between the cotyledons. And here you see a row of early carrots. You can see the cotyledons there and the true leaves, and in between you can see young radishes, which were placed in the row to mark the row. Here is something called corn spurry, which looks quite a bit like carrots. And there it is there grown up. I've seen whole gardens totally covered in this weed. It's a really pernicious weed if it gets a hold. Lettuce, the cotyledons are small and round and little sort of ruffled first leaves coming out between them. There is a lettuce seedling, top and bottom of the cotyledons, and the first leaves coming out. Chickweed is a very important weed in your garden. Watch out for very small, light green leaves, little roundish or pointed leaves. This can quickly take over your garden. Savory has one of the smallest seeds which you'll plant, and very easily lost among the big and vigorous weeds. Note the rounded shape of the cotyledons, but what you can't see here is that they're very deep green color, a very deep, dark, clear green. So watch out for that if you do plant savory. Squash is a great big seedling. You can hardly miss it. And there's the young plant. Here are a couple of weeds. These are the perennial weeds. In the center there is a dandelion. And this is a small sort of daisy-like weed. And buttercup will take over a garden given half a chance, or root that out. And yarrow is a very easily recognized leaf, very broken up, feathery kind of leaf. Get that out of your garden too. Sheep sorrel is easily recognized, these two flags coming out the back of the leaf. You find that sheep sorrel is very good to eat. Take a leaf and chew it up, and you find it's very nice lemony flavor. Once you've planted your seedlings, don't forget to label your rows in some place. Even if you have drawn a plan, you still want to put some kind of label at the end of each string so that you don't get confused later on in the season. I found that little coffee spoons from the local cafeteria make very handy labels. Every time I go and have a cup of coffee, I frick through the garbage bin and collect a whole lot of teaspoons, and then I just take the teaspoons and I rub them around with a bit of sand to roughen the surface, and it makes a very good permanent label. These were from last year, and you can still read the label very clearly if you write it in soft pencil. One of the first and biggest mistakes that the beginner makes is overseeding. The beginner has this irresistible compulsion to plant as many seeds as possible. They're driven to use up every seed in the package. They want to get their money's worth. It's hard to imagine that a little tiny seed, less than a pinhead in diameter, is going to grow into a plant a foot or more across. What generally happens is that germination rate is about 120%, and the whole surface of the ground is raised up by a solid mass of seedlings growing up from below. Here's an example of a flat which is quite a bit overplanted. It's certainly not terribly overplanted, but there are too many seedlings in this flat. If I let this grow for another week or so, it would be one solid mass of plants. Each of them would not have enough room to grow. They'd grow spindly and weak, and I'd end up by losing all of them. Usually by the time the beginner gets around to thinning these excessive numbers of plants, the individuals which are left are so tall and stringy that they can't stand up by themselves. Also, when you pull out plants that are very closely planted, you disrupt the soil and spoil the root formation of the plants which you leave. If you do get into this situation, some people like to use a very fine pair of nail scissors, and they just clip the tops off the plants that they don't want instead of pulling it out and disturbing the roots of the ones that remain. An equally bad mistake would be to plant one seed for every mature plant that you expect to have in your garden. This will result in many empty holes. To do it right, you should space your seeds 3 to 6 times thicker than you would want them at harvest time. This will ensure you that you have no empty spaces and that you can choose the healthiest seedlings. You can plant vegetables like turnips, beets, and lettuce, which have good tasting thinnings, a little bit thicker. Try to remember that plants grow best when they are close but not touching neighboring plants. Beets are a special case because you don't plant a seed, but a seed case, which contains 5 or 6 little seeds. As a result, no matter how sparingly you plant beets, you will always have to thin them later in the season. When you do thin your young plants, reduce the numbers so that each one that remains has an inch or so space around it in every direction. You will be amazed at how fast that space will fill in, and you will have to thin again. You may want to experiment with a small area, sowing seeds broadcast rather than in rows. I'm preparing this bed here for a broadcast sowing of radishes. Trying to get out a few of the bigger rocks, get it all nicely smoothed out. There we go. I have some cherry barrel radishes here. Don't get too many, just a few, like that. And just try to distribute them across the bed. Not too thickly, that's the main point. If you sow them too thickly, you'll be sorry because you'll waste a lot of time thinning. Well, you put it in like that, and then just rake the bed over. Some people like to broadcast carrots. They say they can get the best harvests of carrots doing it this way. They don't get always absolutely perfect carrots. There are some which are too thick and there's some which are stunted in their growth, but they can get a much larger harvest of carrots by broadcasting than in sowing in rows. Some people recommend sowing carrots broadcast, and in order not to overseed, what they recommend doing is mixing the carrot seed with used coffee, semi-dry coffee grounds. And then by mixing the seed thoroughly with the coffee grounds, you're in much better control to distribute the seeds without overseeding. I am not very experienced with broadcasting, so if you do try it and have any success, let me know. Another way to plant your garden is by transplanting partially grown plants. There are 2 reasons for recommending transplanting. Some plants have a long growing season, so that it is necessary to get them started early in the season. These include cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, onions, leeks, tomato, squash. Other plants like chicory, lettuce, herbs can be planted directly into your garden, but I prefer to transplant them from a special seeding area within the greenhouse. I'm intending to transplant more and more of my vegetables, as I found it much more economical of seed and space, and it allows the first weeds more time to grow before I kill them off. This is because using transplants, I tend to plant my garden later. I also save a lot of time trying to figure out the difference between weed seedlings and vegetable seedlings. I save a lot of time on thinning. I also have a much better idea of where the various plants are going in the garden. I'm particularly fond of transplanting lettuce because each plant turns out to be a masterpiece. People that seed lettuce in the ground generally end up with a big collection of tiny little leaves, and they are much more difficult to harvest and clean. The nice thing about transplanting is that you can keep a reserve of young plants available in your transplant area. And when holes open up in the garden, you can start to, as you start to harvest, you can plug these holes up with transplants from your transplant area. The books say that plants with long tap roots cannot be transplanted. However, I transplant turnip and beets on a regular basis without any trouble. I generally set my seeds for transplant in wooden flats or composition trays. These are easy to manage and move about when necessary. I usually fill the trays or flats 3/4 full of good screened garden soil, and then I cover this with 1 inch or so of sterile medium like peat, sand, or vermiculite. I generally mix peat and vermiculite half and half. Now the purpose for using a sterile medium on top of the soil is that some plants, especially the cole crops, are very susceptible to something called damping off. Damping off is a fungus disease which attacks young seedlings. The seedlings will be coming up looking just great, and all of a sudden, next day they'll all be lying on their sides, and when you look carefully at them, you see that the stem right next to the soil is shriveled up into a tiny thread. It's gone to nothing. This is called damping off. And it's a fungus which is in the soil, and it can be prevented by covering the surface of the soil with a sterile medium like peat or vermiculite or sand or a mixture of these. The view you're getting now is taken inside a small greenhouse which I've built inside my big greenhouse. This is a very warm greenhouse. On one side I've put an insulated wall with reflective aluminum, and by putting a greenhouse inside a greenhouse I can keep it even warmer than the outer greenhouse. And this is the place that I'm starting off most of my seedlings. The bed where I'm sitting here is about 3 to 4 feet deep in fresh horse manure. I brought in 2 or 3 pickup loads of horse manure and filled this bed. It's about 6 feet wide and about 20 feet long. And this whole mass of horse manure is rotting away down there and giving a nice little bit of subsoil heat, and as a result the seedlings are all growing away like mad in the beds. Don't forget, this is the 13th of April, and these beets here were planted on the 13th of March. These onions, seedlings, they were planted 13th of March, as were these spinach and this lettuce here. And down at the other end, I've got tomato seedlings, and I've got cabbage seedlings, and all kinds of things growing really nice and early in the season. Now you can see that these are really quite densely packed, but this is all right in the seed bed. You wouldn't want your plants to be planted outside like this. But in a seed bed, it's all right to plant them a little bit denser, because you're going to be lifting them out and you're going to be transplanting them into larger quarters as they get a little bit bigger. Okay, the beet seedlings I'm going to be planting in this tray here. Plant them, 3 or 4 inches apart, and these will make very nice greens in a couple of weeks. And what I'll do is harvest every second plant and leave the remainders to grow a little bit so I have a nice beetroot. I'd say by mid-May I should have harvested most of these beets. So with very little effort you can get a nice few vegetables. Now you can see there isn't really very much to transplanting. You want to dig up your seedlings well from the bottom. You don't want to pull them out like I'm pulling this weed. You want to dig down from the bottom. Try to get as much of the root mass as you possibly can. See how far the root mass stretches down there. Whereas if you pull it up, you don't get any root at all. And then once you have dug it up, you want to make sure to try and transplant it, put it back in the ground just as soon as possible. If this is not possible, then you may have to wrap your seedlings in a wet newspaper or something, but keep those roots well moistened all the time. When you decide that you're going to transplant young plants, you've got to remember that the act of transplanting is a rather traumatic experience for the plant. They're getting dug up by the roots, and obviously there's going to be some shock in the transplanting process. There was one worker in Italy who claimed that plants have feelings, that they feel pain. And it was his contention that when you transplant a plant, it suffers such intense pain that it sets it back in shock, and it takes quite a while for that young plant to take off and grow again. So he put bell jars over the seedlings before transplanting them and put in chloroform and anesthetized them before transplanting, and he claimed that the plants took off and grew much faster than they did when he didn't anesthetize them. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should anesthetize your transplants, but that is, that's an extreme reaction, of course. However, there are some things we can do to make the transplanting process easier on the plant. First of all, the time of day. Pick a cool, cloudy day, or preferably pick late in the evening to do your transplanting. If you transplant early on the morning of a sunny day, you'll just see your plants wilt and turn into nothing, because the main purpose of the roots, of course, is to take up water. And when you transplant them, they have a great deal of difficulty getting back to functioning to take in the water. So transplant on a cool day, or shade your transplants, or transplant late in the evening. Another thing you're going to want to do is to set your plants down in a very fertile, attractive medium. So perhaps instead of just digging them directly into the soil, dig a little hole and put in a couple of quarts or a gallon of compost, and set your transplant directly in the middle of the compost. And this will give it the kind of environment that will encourage it to take off and grow very rapidly. After you set your plant, firm the soil down around the plant so that it is the roots are well surrounded by the soil. Mound the soil up around the base of the plant a little bit to give it lots of support. This is particularly important, as I think I told you earlier, with the cole crops, which you want to set quite deep into the soil so that the base of the true leaves are just above the surface of the soil. If you set them at the level that they're growing now, the plant will tend to fall over and then start growing up, forming a defective-looking plant. After you have set the plant and firmed the earth around it, give it a good thorough soaking. And once you've done all these things, you should have just about 100% success in your transplanting. It's not a difficult job if you just remember a few of those little hints. That's all I want to say about seeding and transplanting. I'd like to hear back from you to see what kind of success you've had, and if you have any particular problems, then don't forget to write me. Next week, we'll be talking about cultivating your garden. Since this film was shot, a year has passed. We've grown a garden, run some more experiments, and experienced a rather severe drought in July. And as a result of this new experience, I'm going to have to rethink some of my ideas on planting times. If you think back, I told you to plant late, to wait till the first flush of weeds came out, to wait till the leaves came out on the trees. In this way, you'd save yourself a lot of weeding time. The ground would be warmed up sufficiently so that the seeds could take off and grow quickly and efficiently. And all of these things that I said are true and remain true. But having followed my own advice this summer, I ran into some rather severe trouble as a result of the very dry spell which we had, which started immediately at the time of planting and ran almost right through July. And as a result, I felt I virtually lost the benefits of a long, warm spell in July, because my plants simply didn't take off and grow as they should have. And this is what I think happened. I waited till the ground had warmed up waited till the weeds had come up and I could destroy the first flush of weeds, and then I planted my seeds. The soil was starting to dry out by that time. But the seeds germinated, and they came up, small seedlings, and the ground continued to dry out and dry out and dry out. It was very warm, very dry, lots of dry wind, and the soil simply became parched. Now these very small seedlings didn't have their roots deep down into the ground, where there was ample moisture. So they simply stopped growing, and they sat there and sulked for about 3 or 4 weeks, which was a very discouraging thing for me. Now some neighbors of mine who had planted early had gotten their beets and their carrots and their turnips into the ground very early in the season. Maybe these seedlings hadn't grown very much early in the season, but when this hot, dry weather came, the seedlings had established sufficient root pattern so that the roots could reach down below the superficial dry area and get down into the deeper water. So I think what I'm going to have to tell you now is to figure on planting several times during the season. As soon as you can get out into the garden, as soon as you can prepare your garden, say the end of May, early June, try a planting of turnip tops, peas, carrots, beets, turnips perhaps. Try planting out in the garden some early cabbage if you want. Try planting some of these hardy varieties of vegetables. Now you might have trouble with the weeds, or you're going to have to watch the weeds. Now if you have a very cold spell and they get killed, so what? You replant. You've got lots of time. But if warm weather comes and warm, dry weather comes, then you'll be ahead of the game. Then the plants will have established themselves, the roots will be down deep enough so that they'll be able to survive the dry spell better than they would have by planting late in the season. You can always replant, but if you lose that early time, you might get behind in the season. Now, in the end, it didn't really matter too much. In the end, I got just as good a crop as I would have by planting earlier. I simply didn't have very many vegetables to eat during July. I planted turnips as late as the 17th of July, and I ended up with very large, very well-developed turnips. So, plant many times, plant numerous times through the season, and by doing this you extend the chances that you've got of getting a successful crop.